Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another live interview here at Strata Internal Performance, Move and Exercise Pain Free. I'm excited. I'm stoked. Today we have Dr. Christina. She's a naturopathic doctor, and we're going to be talking about all. Excuse me. I'm already waffling. Everybody, we're talking all about metabolic flexibility, insulin resistance, a whole bunch of different stuff. It's going to be a lot of amazing information. And before we go too far, I'd love to introduce our lovely guest, Dr. Christina. Christina, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Listen, thank you for spending your time with us. We are very blessed to have someone with your knowledge here. You and I spoke on the phone for, I think, almost 40 minutes one day. I love what you had to say about the human body and what you do with people. And I'd love to pick your brain a little bit about today's topic. But before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your story, how you became a naturopathic doctor, and why you're so passionate about this topic?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, it's definitely a bit of a personal story. Not myself, but definitely by those around me and my loved ones. So, I'm Portuguese by background. And if anyone belongs in that community, a lot of us know that there's quite a bit of metabolic dysfunction. So, there's a lot of diabetes and congestive heart failure and high blood pressure. And so I sort of grew up watching my grandmother dealing with her own health issues, and really kind of going in a negative path. So, what I mean by that is all the negative consequences that come with type 2 diabetes, including blindness and kidney failure, and almost to the point of amputation. So, having to cut off her foot, which thank God didn't go that way. But I just started to question health, question like how she got to that point, who were her allies around her that were supporting her, making sure that she wasn't progressing in the way she was. And funny enough, I actually started working in pharmacy, and I just started to see the same patterns in so many people and so many medications being prescribed to help people, really stabilize their blood sugars or their cholesterol. And really, you start to wonder how many more pills can one take to really
Mm.
achieve the goal that they're looking for. And so I feel like naturopathic medicine kind of found me in that way. So I was really trying to figure out my next steps after, studying science and, what am I going to do with my life? And so, yeah, I just felt like it was right. I wanted to have conversations that empowered people to make the health changes that they needed to make to support themselves, to not rely on, a 15-minute doctor visit to get their health right. Really, like health does not live in the doctor's office. It just does not, right? Like we have to realize that it's everything outside of that that really either makes or breaks our health. And so yeah, so this is where I'm at now, and clearly my focus is insulin resistance and metabolic health, and this is what I talk about all the time, and I love it. And it's just so amazing to see people take ownership and see the changes that they want to see in their health.
I mean, there's so many amazing things we can unpack there. I mean, even just the way you ended on there, like people taking ownership for their health, that's a huge thing. And a lot of the clients that I see and the people that I know that end up seeing naturopathic doctors like yourself are the kind of people who have realized it's time for me to start taking steps to do things that are right for me and for me to take charge. I found, God bless the allopathic model, like taking nothing away from like medical doctors, like GPs, all that kind of stuff. They do some amazing work, but it does not often encompass everything else that could be taken a look at in terms of like what's the root cause and what's going on. And so, I mean, I don't want to blabber on too much, but that's why I love kind of your approach to it and how you're already introduced, how you look at these kind of things, because we really do have to take a look at the whole person. And I always like meeting people who are interested in insulin resistance because it is becoming a bigger and bigger issue over time, spanning the decades, especially women like yourself, because most of the research early on was done all in men. And so it's great to see more women in the field taking that on. I'd love to know, right? This
Mm-hmm.
idea of like being insulin resistant and metabolically flexible. We've talked about insulin resistance previously. If you don't mind, if you can give us like kind of a brief definition of what insulin resistance is, but then I would love to hear a little bit more about what metabolic flexibility is, because I think that's going to be a pretty new topic, at least to me and to a lot of other people.
Yeah. So insulin resistance, basically, I mean, if we boil it down to the most simplistic sentence, is really just your body no longer having the response it should be to insulin. Okay. So insulin is the main hormone that is involved in blood sugar regulation. So each time we eat, we're causing a change in our blood sugar. The body will sense that. The pancreas will release insulin to help bring down our blood sugars back to baseline, typically after 2 hours after eating. So that is sort of what is happening on a regular basis. Now, the issue becomes with progressive sort of stimulation, and often what that means is overstimulation, typically with like high carbohydrate diets. And by high carbohydrate, I definitely am talking more about refined sugars and processed foods specifically, that really kind of, take the level or the needs of the body to certain extremes. When we're talking about sort of, the conversation about snacking and should we snack or should we not, which is a whole different conversation. But again, thinking about the fact that each time we eat, we're eliciting a response in our body, that in of itself can then tax the pancreas to constantly be producing insulin and responding. And eventually over time, what happens is it's almost like a lock and key situation. So on our cells, there's like little keyholes basically, and insulin is the key, and insulin will come in, turn the key, and blood or sugar will come into the cells so that it clears out of our bloodstream. And ultimately, right, we want to use that sugar for fuel, right? So our muscles, our brain, right, every aspect of our body, we need that energy. When the cells become overexposed to sugar and they don't necessarily need that energy, there's two things that can happen. One is there's the theory of insulin is no longer, it's like the wrong key. So it's no longer opening the receptors. So there's sort of that signaling disruption that's not happening anymore. But the other thing too is that the cells can actually downregulate that keyhole or that receptor. So there's, instead of having like multiple points of entry, right? Like think of a house, right? We have our front door, we have our back door. Those entry points start to disappear almost. So the cell starts to take away those keyholes because it doesn't want to respond to insulin anymore. It doesn't need any more energy coming in. And that's when we start to see the insulin resistance, which means that we start to see things like elevated blood sugar. We start to see increased inflammation. We start to see higher triglyceride or even overall cholesterol in the body. So we start to see the metabolic changes that, often are sort of the conversation points in a doctor's office, right? Like your blood sugars are high, your
Right.
cholesterol is high. And these are sort of the ticking points that people are like, oh, okay. But what that really means is that insulin resistance has probably been playing for a long time. There's some research that's actually saying that insulin resistance can be present for 10 to 15 years before the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. That's a long time. That's so many points where we can be making lifestyle changes to really, whether it's to push forward the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes or prevent it altogether, right? So this is where, I like to talk about insulin resistance, because if we're looking at 10 to 15 years of a timeline, that's a lot of conversation, a lot of prevention, a lot of habits that we can be instilling to really promote our health, promote metabolic flexibility, which we'll talk about in a second, and really eliminate insulin resistance.
It almost sounds like, because from what I understand, I mean, carbohydrates are a major fuel source for the body, or they primarily can be used as a fuel source for the body. And again, if I'm butchering things, you let me know.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, to me, it kind of sounds like you're filling up a car with gasoline, and you only need so much gas. You can only fill up your car with so much gasoline every time your tank is getting empty. And once the tank is filled up, you don't need more gasoline. But if you keep pumping gasoline and putting that in the system, it's going to overflow. It's going to spill everywhere. If you got a garage, all of a sudden now you got to put like sawdust down. You got to clear everyone out, and like it disrupts the entire workflow of like a mechanical garage. So it
Yeah.
sounds like there's like some real big repercussions. Like it might seem like not a big deal to be maybe overeating carbohydrates, but over time, it's really going to mess up everything else around your body. And like, obviously that's very colloquial. Like it's not very well articulated, but is that kind of like what it might be like, or am I way off? And that's fine if I am. Please correct
No,
me if
no,
I'm wrong.
I love the analogy. And what I would say even is like that spill off effect too, is when we start to even see like fatty deposits around our organs, right? So
Mm.
when, you know, when people go for an ultrasound and all of a sudden there's, you know, fatty deposits on the liver, there's fatty deposits on the pancreas, that's that overspill where the body's just trying to like place things. Here's the thing, the body doesn't like to waste, right? Like the body is like, it likes to conserve, right? It has its just in case mechanism, right? Like just in case Christina doesn't have food tomorrow, let's, you know, back things up, right? And when we're talking about backing things up in the body, we're talking about fat and fat storage, right? So we have to understand that mechanism as well. Like the body is still very archaic and it's still thinking in the like in the alignment of survival, right? So the body's going to make sure that it's got everything it needs to survive. And in this day and age where there's not a scarcity of food, right? This is where we start to see a lot of that overspill, like you're talking about.
So we've got like potentially 10 to 15 years of buildup where people could be like pre-diabetic, insulin resistance is building. It almost sounds like it could be a silent killer for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to move away and figure out, okay, how do we become less insulin resistance, which also seems like another way of saying like how to become more flexible in a way. And this is kind of the crux of the conversation, which is, you know, you're an expert in metabolic flexibility. And I'm hoping before we dive too far into the whole shebang, if you can kind of define what it means to be metabolically flexible or what metabolic flexibility even is.
So being metabolically flexible means that your body is able to shift energy sources depending on what's available, right? So in the case of right after you eat, again, right, the main thing is that you're going to have an uptick in your blood sugar, especially depending on what you're eating, right? But essentially the blood sugar will rise and that will become your fuel source, right? Your body's going to take it out of the bloodstream, shunt it into the cells, and then it's going to start producing energy to fuel your day, right? Whether that means, you know, taking your kids to school, whether that means sitting at your computer and doing, you know, mental work, right? The brain utilizes a lot of sugar to function. So that is sort of the main premise. Now, here's the thing. Should you not be able to eat, or like, let's say you have a really busy day and, you know, lunch gets delayed, being metabolically flexible means that you should be able to withstand a couple of hours where you're not necessarily having immediate fuel sources, again, sugar being the most immediate one, and being able to switch over to fat burning, right? And here's the thing, like your body's never like just in sugar burning or just in fat burning. It's always kind of relative, right? It's like a percentage, right? Like, are you 80% sugar burning versus 20% fat burning, right? So it's always sort of a metric. But we want to be able to shift that, right? Your body should be like, okay, well, Christina doesn't have enough sugar. It seems like she's not going to be eating anytime soon. Let's start to utilize some of her fat stores to get her until her next meal. And so that's the metabolically, like being metabolically flexible. It doesn't really matter if you aren't eating on a regular schedule. You should still be able to kind of get through your day. What that means is like what the sort of common symptoms that people will sort of report when there are signs of metabolic inflexibility is that they can't get from meal to meal. They're like I have to eat at 1 o'clock or I get hangry, right? Like it's that irritable, I can't focus, I'm sweating, I have a headache. And it's because their body like is literally panicking. It's almost like if you don't eat now, like something's bad's gonna happen because it's not shifting gears. And people, because we have so much food coming in, the body has almost become lazy in a sense, right? So it's like, well, I've got sugar coming in almost all the time. So why am I going to put the effort, right? It takes a little bit more effort to burn fat versus sugar. And so this is where that it's almost like your car is stuck in first gear. I don't know. I don't drive manual cars, but I'm going to assume that that's what it's like, right? So it's kind of like that halt that's not happening, if that makes sense.
And so Oh yeah, no, 100% makes sense. I mean, it sounds like, in an ideal world, if you are like a healthy person, and I get that can mean any number of things to any other people, but let's take it as like an average healthy person. If you're an average healthy person, you should be able to not have to always be thinking about when your next meal is, and feel like you have the energy and the ability to keep doing whatever you're doing. If there's like something unexpected happens, you need a couple extra hours before you can eat. Is that what I understand? Like at a basis, metabolic flexibility is.
Exactly, exactly. Like it should be like your day is not surrounded by when your next meal is, right? Like you should be able to do what you need to do, but also obviously honor your hunger when it comes in, because clearly that's your body telling you need to eat. But not to the point where like it's debilitating, right? Like for some people, it's to the point where, they have snacks in their bags because they're just so worried that they're going to hit that
Mm.
stage of not being able to function, which is important to understand. And it's important to acknowledge that that's a sign of something, right? And in this case,
Mhm.
it's metabolic inflexibility.
So when it comes to insulin resistance, potentially leading to like something worth like metabolic syndrome or diabetes type 2, when it comes to that, how does like being metabolically flexible have a positive impact on insulin resistance and some of its subsequent more worse, disease states, so to speak?
So, in terms of, sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so like I guess maybe like think about a practical example here. So like
Yeah.
suppose it's me, and let's say like I'm at the place where like my doctors told me like I'm insulin resistant, so I do my blood work and like it's clear that I'm moving in that direction. So
Mhm.
that would be an indication not as metabolically flexible. So like if I'm engineering that and kind of moving backwards with it, if I'm someone who, let's say like I am starting to worry about insulin resistance and its causes, what are the benefits of being metabolically flexible for me? Does that look like it's going to help me regulate my blood sugar better, so I'm not going to be as insulin resistant? You talked about how if you're always having carbohydrates and sugars in your diet before, and you give yourself way too much of that, like that key receptor starts to shrink down because it's way too much. I'm just curious, right?
Mhm.
Practically speaking, how working on metabolic flexibility will have a positive impact on insulin resistance. I'm not sure if I did a good job explaining that, and you can ask me to
Yeah.
pose it again. Maybe I can say it differently.
Yeah. So, what I would say is, so first and foremost, I think the reason why insulin resistance almost gets missed until it's starting to show an actual, if we want to call it a disease state. So, sort of those end markers of insulin resistance, which is, just overt type 2 diabetes, or, you know, overt fatty liver, where there's, significant amounts of fatty deposits around organs, whether it's, high cholesterol, whatever that end point is. The reason why insulin resistance is almost not a topic of conversation is because it's not tested. Okay.
Mm,
So I think first and foremost is actually having the conversation of how can we effectively identify it so that we can have
mm,
engaging and empowering conversations with patients. The reason why I say this is this: I'm a very advocate person about blood work and having the biochemical markers that show us, like, if in fact it is present or not. Because when a person can actually see what their blood is telling them, it's almost like there's a bit of an aha moment, like, oh,
mm,
okay, yeah, and I can do something to change it. So first and foremost, we have to do that. So often the things that are being tested with within the medical system is fasting glucose, right? So how much sugar is in the bloodstream, and something called HbA1c, or commonly just referred to as A1C. A1C is a measure of what your blood sugar regulation looks like over 3 months. Okay. Now, here's the thing: these two markers, one, don't test your insulin, and two, are basically just your barometer of, like, is your blood sugar rising or not, right? And
mm.
so basically, once you're getting to the point of prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, like I said, the insulin resistance has probably already been present for a long time,
Right.
right? And only now is it showing. So, first and foremost, I would say testing is going to be key. There's
Mm,
two things that we can test. We can test fasting glucose still, but also your fasting insulin. So, how much insulin is circulating to actually keep your blood sugar within range. Now, the reason why I say this is important is I see a lot of people where their A1C is fine, their fasting sugar is fine, and their fasting insulin is through the roof, which means that their body's working really, really hard to maintain that control, right?
Mm,
Eventually, something's got to give, right?
right.
The other thing is we can actually do something called an insulin glucose challenge, where you drink lovely 75 grams of sugar. I just did this on Monday myself. And we actually check. So you'll get a blood draw done at fasting, you'll get it done at a half hour, 1 hour, 2 hour, but we can dynamically see how your body's responding to this sugar load. And
Mhm.
that can be really important information, because with that, we can understand, should you snack or should you not? If at 2 hours your sugar and insulin are still high, you probably should not be snacking throughout the day. But at least we have your own data to verify that nutritional modification. So now your nutrition becomes important to your own physical data, not just, everyone should fast or everyone should not snack, right? Well, it depends, right, on each person. Um, and then the other thing I was just going to say is, in terms of insulin resistance, is the importance of being insulin sensitive is that you really delay either the onset of a chronic condition, right? That's not to say that it may not still happen, although we're severely decreasing the likelihood. But you also then, we talked about this on our phone call, is your quality of life, right? Like, do you
Huge.
want to live a life where you're on 10 different medications, your mobility is severely restricted, you can't play with your grandkids, like whatever your quality of life is, depending on how
Mhm.
you define that. I think that's where, the question of how, like, what do you want to put in place to make sure that you are metabolically flexible and insulin sensitive.
So I mean, it sounds like so I think you had said initially there was two tests that most people look at, but they don't really take a look at your fasting insulin.
Mhm.
And so can you tell me what those first two were again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so the common two tests
Yeah,
are fasting sugar, fasting glucose,
right.
and then something called HbA1c, which is just a marker of 3 months of your blood sugar control. So it's sort of an average, essentially.
Got it. And so it's interesting because like when I heard you say that, and like this is what I really got and it clicked for me, is like at that point those are more like symptomatic things, like, hey, like we got some tests and they're showing us symptoms, but they might not actually be showing us like the root cause of where you're at or like really what's going on, right? They're like more tertiary or secondary inferences. But then you talked about like, hey, why don't we do this I think it's a fasting oral glucose tolerance test. I might have butchered that. Is
It's a
like,
little different. So it's called the insulin glucose challenge,
my
but
apologies.
similar.
No,
Yeah.
no, I mean like similar, but obviously the names are important. So this insulin test, and that's actually going to give you that objective data you're looking for, which I love because I feel like as human beings, like on a conscious level, and we all do this, like we have our own biases and we can all explain away things in our brains. Like that's the human conscious mind. But when you see objective data and information, it becomes a lot harder to do that, right? To like kind of deny, well, this is really what's happening.
Yeah.
So like let's say now we've identified like, yep, it looks like I have some level of insulin resistance. I'm really trying to get ahead of this thing here.
Mhm.
What are some of the steps that people can take if they know this information, or if they just suspect, hey, you know what? I do get really, really hungry or hangry if I don't eat right when I need to, or I do feel like I could be, I am crashing a lot. Like even if people are having the subjective sensations versus getting that objective data, what are some things people can do to start moving towards being more metabolically flexible and just feeling amazing, living a life they love?
Yeah. So I feel like there's three super easy things to focus on. So first and foremost is really nutrition, and sort of what that entails, right? And like I said, right, that can be very much tailored to, for example, like if you do an insulin glucose challenge, right? The question of like, should you snack or not snack would be really based on that information there. But there's a lot of other things that we can do that really support insulin sensitivity, insulin response, and just making sure that we're having good blood sugar control. So, one is polyphenols, which is found in your berries. So, one of the things I love telling people to do is like eat your berries. Like they're so, so important. I find sometimes people are a little afraid of fruit because it's like, oh,
Mhm.
but it has sugar. And fair enough. But the benefits that you're getting from berries like far exceeds the effect it's having on your blood sugar, which is very minimal anyways. And a lot of, you know, plants are smarter than people, and they have like all the things that we need in there, right? It's got fiber, it's got all the vitamins and minerals. So you're getting bang for your buck almost when you're having, you know, really rich fruits like your blackberries, your blueberries, your pomegranates, your gojis, right? Like these are like things that should be included. The other thing too is protein. So I harp on protein so much because for a couple of reasons. One is more often than not, when I do sort of a macronutrient exercise, like a macronutrient tracking exercise with patients, they always inevitably, when they come back for a follow-up, they're like, the first week that I was doing it, my carbs were through the roof and my protein was, you know, in the toilet. And it's almost always the case, like carbs high, protein low. And the moment we start to shift that sort of ratio of the two macronutrients, energy starts to improve, their mood starts to improve. They realize that, you know, they're not hangry at 10:30. They can get to 12 or 1 o'clock before they're feeling hungry again, right? So this massive change just by protein and like making sure that you're getting adequate amounts is massive. Like I cannot emphasize that enough. The other thing too, which I think you can really speak to this as well, is that as we age, you know, whether we like to admit it or not, and this often happens a lot sooner, like it's not in our 40s and 50s, but actually starting in our 30s, we start to lose lean muscle, right? So imagine that you start to lose the muscle that literally makes you metabolically active, right? Like muscle is almost like a sink, or I like to call it like a sponge, right? Where it's just soaks everything up, right? So your ability to shunt sugar out of your bloodstream and utilize it for fuel is a lot higher if you've got the muscle mass to support that versus not, right? And so we need adequate amounts of protein, one, to maintain the muscle that we have, but then we also need to do the exercise portion, which I'll talk about in a second. But protein becomes so key for so many reasons. And I think it's one of the things that people, like, if we start to just create a little more awareness and focus around that, can be a real game changer. And then the other thing, which I know is, you know, it's really hot in like on social media and sort of discussion groups, is like fasting. And do you fast or do you not, right? And I would say that fasting has merit. Fasting has a time and place. The degree into which you fast, right? So, you know, some people do one meal a day, right? Where they're eating within a 4-hour window and they're doing a 20-hour fast. There's some people who go up to 72 hours without eating, right? So I think that conversation should be had between the individual and their practitioner, because obviously we want to do that in a safe way. But there's daily like practices where it is important to ensure that you are having a certain amount of hours where you're fasting. We're not designed to be eating all day, right? And that really creates the stage for insulin resistance to occur, because you're constantly causing your body to respond to your blood sugar. So, you know, whether it's a 10-hour day, like 10 hours where food's coming in and 14 hours where you're fasting, whether it's 16-8, whether it's 12-12, right? People need to decide what works for them. But I do think fasting is an effective tool when it comes to metabolic flexibility.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No.
Listen, I'm not going to stop your flow. You're on a roll. Please.
No, please.
No.
Go ahead.
All I was going to say is like the fasting conversation is interesting always to me, because I used to be someone that fasted a lot. I'm working with nutritionists now. We're trying some different stuff. But like one of the things that came up was like this idea of like, you know, like anytime you're not eating, you're starting to fast. Like even if you eat a meal and then you have your last bite, you can consider like that until your next meal, like a 4 or 5 hour fast. And I guess just to give, you know, context, one of the things that I really love that you said there was like the idea of a 10 or 12 hour fast. I think a lot of people, you know, sometimes forget that if you eat your last meal at 9 and you go to bed at 11 and then you don't wake up till 7, then you eat breakfast at 8, you're still getting close to those 10 or 11 hours to begin with. It's not like that crazy of a thing to say that, hey, you're going to fast for 10 or 12 hours in a day if you're just leaving some hours before bed and then, you know, an hour after you wake up. So I just wanted to put that out there. But again, I don't want to kill your flow. You're doing a great job here. I love it.
No, and what I would say to that point too, and I do this myself, and I often say it to patients, is like, it's so easy to do it overnight because you're
Mhm.
sleeping and you can't really feel it, right? So I
Yeah.
often, like, I know, like, one of the things that I find a lot of people struggle with is like, I can't delay my breakfast till 12 and then, eat till 8 so that they can get that 8 hour and then 16. And I'm like, well, why
Mhm.
don't you just shift it? And it's like, there's this aha moment of like, oh, I didn't know. So it's so much, especially if you are a breakfast person. Like if you are hungry when you wake up, by all
Mhm.
means eat. Start your time then, right? Time it accordingly and then do it overnight. And it becomes so much easier. It just becomes part of your daily practice. And it's not something that you feel like you have to, work through versus just kind of like orienting your day around that. So I find that a really effective strategy as well. And people like it's super easy to implement.
Well, I mean, one
Um,
one of the things I love about the strategies that you're just talking about, and I think you said something about exercise, and I also want to be mindful of time because we initially said 9:40, but I got extra time if you
it's
got it.
okay. Yeah.
One of the things I love so far about the strategies you've shared is that they're simple to action. Like it's not that hard to move your dinner up an hour or two, right? For most people, and it's not too hard to like instead of having bananas or whatever, have berries for a snack. Like these are all very practical things, right? You're going to eat protein with dinner, have a little bit more protein, have a little bit less carbohydrate. Like these are all amazingly easy to action things. So like, thank you so much for making it like easy for people to start working with what they got.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the thing. And here's what I always tell people as well is progress over perfection, right?
Mhm,
Maybe
mhm,
you start with just the fasting window, right? Maybe that's your point of entry. Maybe it is looking at protein and seeing if you have enough. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And even by working on the little things, it can make a huge difference. And one last thing I will say about the fasting and especially about timing
yes,
it overnight, and this kind of will lead like is sort of the last thing I was going to say is that it can actually really improve your sleep quality as well. So what
mhm,
I do find is when people eat really late, they often feel like they don't get good sleep. And the way I explain it is your body temperature is supposed to drop when you're going to bed, right? That's what initiates sleep. When you eat really late, the fact that your body still has to work to digest what you just consumed, that process in of itself can actually increase your body temperature. And so now you have literally impeded the natural process of your body temperature dropping, right? So that means like people will find that they're having difficulty falling asleep or they're
mhm,
tossing and turning at night. And so the moment that we shift dinner, like you said, even an hour earlier, all of a sudden the sleep quality improves as well. So it's such a trickle effect where it's not just metabolic health, but how it impacts everything else. And here's the thing, if you're not sleeping well, you're also not going to be metabolically flexible, right? Because your hunger cues are going to be off the chart. I'm sure I can attest to this. If I don't have a good night's sleep, I'm snacking so much the next day, right? Because I'm like, I'm hungry. I need to keep myself
mhm.
awake, right? So even just getting good sleep can be the thing that makes or breaks your metabolic health, right? So imagine
Absolutely.
that, right? And we're not even talking about nutrition. We're just talking about good sleep, right? So I think that's very interesting as well. And when you start to connect the dots, it almost again, right? You're just like, oh yeah, it makes sense.
It's almost like the body is a whole thing. You have to look at all the individual pieces and how they work together. It's almost like holistic naturopathic doctors might help you.
Right?
Uh, we're getting close to time here. I'm happy to go for another 10 minutes. I don't want to abuse your time. I know you want to talk about exercise a little bit, and I also had a couple questions from the group as well. So I don't know
Yeah.
if you want to how you want to handle this here. Could we be going for a few more minutes, or do you want to be like, Glenn, I know I got to go, and it's fine too. There's no skin off my back. I totally understand.
No, no, I'm happy. I would love to, I mean, I can talk about exercise, but if there's questions, I'm more than happy to address those because people are here for answers.
So I'll tell you what I got. I'm gonna put the first one up here. It's gonna go back a little bit more from an earlier part of the conversation. But we had a question. So is giving up sugars and bad carbs helpful to reduce AC1 and insulin resistance?
Right. So I'm assuming by bad carbs, we're talking. So when we quote unquote bad carbs, I want to just premise no food is bad or good,
Nice.
but so what I'm going to say here is when we're talking about carbs, we want to talk about what they're providing us. Okay.
Mm.
So good carbs, right, are your fruits and veggies. Why? They provide a lot of fiber, right? And fiber will naturally slow down the digestive process. It will slowly release like sugar into the bloodstream. So instead of getting rapid increases in blood sugar that cause the need for the pancreas to secrete that insulin to get things back down, it's having a more gradual response. So the pancreas doesn't have to be spewing out insulin as much. So bad carbs could be things like, for example, like rice, right? It's not necessarily a bad carb, but we do know that it is quite stimulating to that insulin response. So then we need to be mindful of quantity, right? So it's not that you can't have rice, but it could be how much you're having and what you're having it with, right? Like, are you having it with enough protein and are you having it with enough fat? Sugars, obviously, like, when we're talking about your Starbucks drink that has like, I don't know how many pumps of, I don't know what they're putting in there, that is going to have a massive, impact on blood sugar. So absolutely, I would say sugars by like sugar in general, white sugar needs to be modified and had, not in excess, right? So whether it's, a treat you're having once a week or whatever it may be, right? Like that is something that you need to be mindful of. And by virtue of looking at sugar and your quote unquote bad carbs, obviously it is going to help reduce your A1C and it's going to help reduce your insulin resistance because you're not having that excessive demand on things.
Perfect. And I really love that you tied in like, hey, like that thing isn't bad on its own. In excess, it's not good. But if you have these other things like protein, fiber, it's going to mitigate, the effect of that. So like have it together in combination with these things.
Yeah.
Love that. Got one more question for you.
Mm-hmm.
This one right here. As long as it's caffeine free, are teas okay after dinner if fasting?
Yeah, good question. So this is actually a great question, and it's one that I have with a lot of patients. So I will say that any herbal tea, so like chamomile or peppermint, um, does not really impact the fast. So it can be had after dinner. So usually I say only water or a non-caffeinated beverage, so teas, because there's sort of a hot debate. Depending on who you talk to, they'll say black coffee is totally fine outside of the fast. It doesn't impact things, and other people say it's not. Okay, I personally do not agree that caffeine is okay during the fasting hours because if you think about what caffeine is what we call a sympathomimetic. So what it's going to do is it's going to stimulate your sympathetic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight response. It's see a bear and run away, right? And what that means is that your body is going to need sugar to fuel those muscles to
Mm.
run away, right? So what it's going to do is it's going to release a lot of our stress hormones like epinephrine, cortisol. And what these hormones do is that they cause the liver to release sugar into the bloodstream to become available for that stressor, right? And so it does impact the blood sugar. And I do find it's one of those things that can really impact people's like energy, mood, like all things throughout the day. And so caffeine is one that can have quite impactful metabolic effects and should not be consumed during your fasting hours.
I love that because it sounds like, and like you kind of touched about this earlier, it's like, hey, when we're fasting between meals, we're kind of rest and digest, let the body digest the food, do everything that it needs to. But then if we're throwing in this other thing, which is going to start causing like the breakdown or the stress again, we're kind of undoing or at least mitigating what we're trying to do during this rest and digest phase. So it totally makes sense when you explain it like that, like, hey, maybe your coffee in the morning with breakfast or whatever, but when we get later in the day and in between these meals, we really should not be having that. That's what I'm hearing at least.
Exactly. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, tell you what, we're getting close to time here, and I love asking the rapid fire questions. It's a lot of fun. So if it's okay
Yeah.
with you, we're going to go to rapid fire segment,
Let's
okay?
do it.
All right, everybody, rapid fire segment, some fun questions. Dr. Christina,
Yeah.
if you could gift one book to everybody you've ever met, what book would it be?
I feel like I'm biased because I recently read it. It was the first book I read during the pandemic,
Mhm.
and it was Atomic Habits by James Clear. It
Okay.
literally took my physical activity routine from 0 to 100, I would say. So I think everyone should read it, especially if you're looking to implement a new health habit, right? Whether that's working out, whether that's going for a walk, whether it's drinking 8 glasses of water, whatever it is, he does such a beautiful job at breaking down the psychology around habits, and like strategies to get yourself to where you want to be. So fantastic job, or fantastic book, and everyone should have it.
Yeah, so it's interesting you said that, because you're I think either the last person we interviewed or the person before that said the same book, which is
Okay.
wild that out of all the books that are out there that you could possibly read, that one came up twice. So it must be an amazing book.
Yeah.
Dr. Christina, what is a quote to live by?
I'm gonna say be the change you want to see in the world.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, right on. What is the theme song to your life?
Okay, I don't know, but I'm gonna say the first song that popped into my head is Girls Just Wanna Have Fun, and
Amazing.
mostly because it was my graduation song from high school. So that's gonna be it.
Listen, love it. No justification required. And usually whatever your intuition tells you is the right thing. So don't even worry about that one. That's perfect. Um,
Awesome.
last one here. If you were to go back in time and speak to yourself 10 years ago, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh, what would I tell myself? Um, I would say work out more.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I feel like, I didn't get into like working out until probably in my 20s.
Mhm.
And I think there's just so much to physical activity that I don't even think we fully comprehend yet.
Mhm.
And I feel like the earlier you start, the better. And I would say, yeah, I would say work out more.
Absolutely fantastic. And let me say, I really appreciate that you took the time to think about that answer. And I know that one's like the toughest one here because it really requires you to think and be like, well, what I tell myself 10 years ago.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Thanks.
Before I let you go, and because I really appreciate you've given us so much extra time and amazing information, would you mind telling everyone at home how they can find you, where you live on the internet, all that kind of stuff, if they want to connect with you further?
Yeah. So, as I sort of mentioned, I'm Portuguese, so I call myself the Portuguese naturopath. So you can find me online. My website is theportuguesenaturopath.ca. You can also find me on Instagram at the Portuguese Naturopath, where I post all sorts of things related to metabolic health and how it impacts hormone health, mental health, everything under the sun, just because metabolic health is so intricately related to our health in general. And one last thing is, if you're looking to, if you have any more questions, you maybe are considering naturopathic medicine, but you're unsure of what to expect, what it would look like, what are the costs. I do offer a 15-minute free discovery session, which you can book online through my website. And it really just gives us a chance to connect and talk about how we can work together, and then go from there.
Awesome. Beautiful. Everybody go check out Christina all over the place. She's wonderful. Got some great feedback here. Such an informative session. Thank you very much. Janet Dean Walter also asked, can you give that book name again? Could you just tell her what the book name was called again, please?
Yeah, so it's called Atomic Habits by James Clear.
Perfect. Atomic Habits by James Clear.
Yeah.
Christina, thank you so much again for spending time with me. Honestly, this was so much fun. I learned a ton. I want to thank you again for coming out and being you. Everybody, please go and check out Christina again. Thank you so much for coming by, Dr. Christina.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
All right, everybody, this has been another Strata live interview. Once again, this is the wonderful Dr. Christine, the Portuguese naturopath. My name's Glenn, and we'll see you on the next one.